Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Queen d1 to g4. Castle kingside. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c7 to c5. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Bishop d3 takes h7, check. King g8 takes h7. Queen g4 to h5, check. King h7 to g8. Knight f3 to g5. Queen e7 takes g5. Queen h5 takes g5. Pawn d4 takes c3. Pawn b2 takes c3. Knight b8 to c6. Pawn f2 to f4. Knight d7 to c5. Queen g5 to h4. Knight c5 to e4. Queen h4 to h3. Pawn b7 to b5. Castle kingside. Bishop c8 to a6. Rook f1 to f3. Rook a8 to c8. Queen h3 to h4. Pawn f7 to f6. Rook f3 to h3. Pawn f6 takes e5. Pawn f4 takes e5. Rook f8 to f5. Pawn g2 to g4. Rook f5 to f4. Queen h4 to h5. Rook c8 to f8. Rook a1 to e1. Bishop a6 to c8. Rook h3 to h4. Knight c6 takes e5. Queen h5 takes e5. Knight e4 to d2. Rook h4 to h3. Rook f4 takes g4, check. King g1 to h1. Knight d2 to e4. Rook h3 to g3. Knight e4 takes g3, check. Pawn h2 takes g3. Rook g4 to a4. King h1 to g1. Rook a4 to c4. Queen e5 to d6. Rook f8 to e8. Rook e1 to e3. Pawn b5 to b4. Rook e3 to f3. Pawn b4 takes c3. Rook f3 to f4. Rook c4 takes f4. Pawn g3 takes f4. Rook e8 to f8. King g1 to g2. Pawn a7 to a6. Pawn a2 to a3. King g8 to f7. Queen d6 to c7, check. King f7 to g8. King g2 to g3. Rook f8 to e8. King g3 to f3. Rook e8 to f8. Queen c7 to e7. Pawn a6 to a5. King f3 to e3. Pawn a5 to a4. Queen e7 to a7. King g8 to h7. Queen a7 takes a4. King h7 to g6. Queen a4 to c6. Rook f8 to d8. King e3 to d4. King g6 to f6. Queen c6 takes c3. Bishop c8 to d7. Queen c3 to c7. King f6 to e7. Queen c7 to e5. King e7 to f7. Queen e5 to h5, check. King f7 to g8. Queen h5 to g5. Rook d8 to a8. Pawn c2 to c4. Pawn d5 takes c4. Queen g5 to e7. Bishop d7 to e8. King d4 takes c4. Bishop e8 to g6. King c4 to d4. Bishop g6 to f5. King d4 to a3. King g8 to h7. Queen e7 to b4. King h7 to h6. Queen b4 to a7. King h6 to h7. Queen e7 to b4. King h7 to h6. Queen b4 to b2. Rook a8 to a7. Queen b2 to h2, check. King h6 to g6. Queen h2 to b2. King g6 to h5. Queen b2 to e2, check. King h5 to h6. Queen e2 to h2, check. King h6 to g6. Queen h2 to a2. King g6 to h5. Queen a2 to e2, check. King h5 to h6. Queen e2 to h2, check. The game is a draw.